Well, look, over the next few weeks, Tim and I are going to be looking with you at this book, the book of Nehemiah in the Bible. Now, Nehemiah comes in the middle of the first part of the Old Testament. There we go. So there's Nehemiah. You'd expect it to be at the end, but it's not. It's in the middle. But it's a book of action, actually. There are loads and loads of events that go on in this. And I was kind of thinking, I would love to take Nehemiah and give it to Ridley Scott and say to him, look, I've got a great new script for a film. Don't make it like Noah. Just trust me. Do it like it says on the tin. And this is how I see the film going. We open with a shot that pans over a happy, noisy, bustling city of Jerusalem. And we hear one of those deep, husky voiceovers, which I won't do. For 1,000 years, Israel has turned away from her God. Again and again, he's warned them through his prophets not to worship idols and to follow other gods. Eventually, in 587 BC, God's patience runs out and he hands them over to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And the shot changes now, and I can see it darkening. Siege engines are laid against the city. Joy has turned to terror. People are running and screaming as Babylonian troops pillage the city. And then we hear wailing as the temple of God that stood there for hundreds of years is pulled down, the walls of the city destroyed, and dogs run throughout the streets licking blood. May have gone too far there. I think I've just made it an 18. But that's what it was like. It was horrendous. The picture cuts to a different city, one of peace and calm. It's prosperous and successful. A caption reads, King Artaxerxes' palace, Susa, 150 years later. And Nehemiah appears. And I kind of fancy Tim Butler playing Nehemiah. What do you think? I think he'd be great at that. He offers the king a goblet of wine. The king smiles, Nehemiah bows, all is well. The scene cuts again, and it's now at Nehemiah's office a few moments later. There's a knock at the door, and it's Hanani, Nehemiah's brother. He looks tired and dirty. He's clearly been on a long journey. They hug Nehemiah, offers him some water, and they start to talk. How are our Jewish brothers and sisters, Han? They're well. The temple's been rebuilt and they worship there regularly. But what about the walls? The walls of the city. Have they been rebuilt yet? And Han's face falls and he sighs. Oh, Nehemiah, nothing's changed since Ezra the priest stopped from building 15 years ago now, I guess it was. In fact, many of the repairs have started to collapse. To be honest, we're a laughing stock. There's nothing to stop our enemies or the wild animals from just roaming around the streets at night. The economy's tanked. The businesses are shutting down. And at this, Nehemiah is visibly stirred. Something has to be done, he thinks. Something will be done. He's going to be the one to do it. And he leaps into action. And can you see what he does? Verse 4. Can you see what he does? He sits down to weep and pray to God for 4 months. And that's where Ridley Scott goes, forget it, we're not going to do this. 4 months. That's kind of, if you decode the dates at the beginning of chapter 1 and chapter 2, that's how long he mourns and fasts and prays. And the question is, why is he so distraught? Nehemiah describes himself as the cupbearer to the king in verse 11. And I think the danger is we read that and we think, well, that's nice. He's a kind of a butler or a head waiter, isn't he? And in reality, he's so much more than that. He's part of the king's inner circle. The king trusts him to make sure that no food or drink gets past his lips. It's poisoned. He's part of his inner circle. He's living in the palace, in the capital of the known world. He's 1,000 kilometers from Jerusalem. And he gets to spend time with a man who calls himself the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, King Artaxerxes. For a guy who's come from a Jewish background, this is amazing. And yet, did you notice, and it's repeated again and again through that chapter that Paul read for us. Verse 6, for example, he says, I'm a servant. And as a servant of God, that is where he finds his identity. Yes, he may be the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, but he has a much greater allegiance, and that is as a servant of the living God. Now, you know as well as I do, there's a lot of talk about identity today, isn't there? And I think the truth is actually that most of us have lots of different identities. You have an identity by virtue of your relationships. You're a mum or a dad, an uncle or an aunt. You're a grandparent, you're a child, you're a friend, you're a colleague. Your identity might be the team you support, Manchester City, AFC Bournemouth. You may describe yourself in terms of your politics, your career, your sexuality, your gender. But, friends, if we call ourselves a follower of Jesus, then your best identity, the identity that spans over all the others, is as a servant of Jesus Christ. That's who we are. It's the identity that gives meaning and direction to all the others. To parody Lord of the Rings, one identity to rule them all. See, when Nehemiah heard the news from Jerusalem, he could have said to his brother, well, that's a shame, isn't it? What a pity. Look, I'll say a prayer for you. I'll put some money in the collection box. After all, why should he care? He's got such a good thing going on in Susa. And if his best identity was a cupbearer, that's what he would have said, wouldn't he? But it wasn't. He's a servant of the living God. And so he's cut to the heart. And so are we. I don't know where you'll be tomorrow. Natalie's going to be in the RNLI. My guess is you'll be in a very different world to this, right? But as you enter it, remind yourself, first and foremost, you're a servant of God. That's your best identity. And the other thing is, just have a little look around. Go on. They won't mind. Have a little look around. Right? You are not looking right now at people from the Vine Church or people from Poole Christian Fellowship. You're probably looking at people who are servants of the living God. That's who we are. So don't think to yourself over the course of these next few months, oh, they're from Poole, oh, they're from Vine. No. We're just servants of the living God, right? Brothers and sisters in Christ. What we're going to do is we're just going to see how this identity shaped Nehemiah and how it can shape us as we seek to be servants of God. 3 very simple actions. Here's the first. God's servant cares. God's servant cares. Nehemiah is, we'll discover this, he's a robust, he's a courageous man. He's about to oversee a massive building project. He's going to face down multiple enemies, some of whom he's actually going to beat up, but we'll come to that later on. This is not a softie, right? He's not a softie. But when we first meet him, he's in tears. And earlier we asked, why? Why is he so upset about some broken down walls in a city 1,000 kilometers away? I was born in Bournemouth. I lived, first of all, in Alum Chai, and then we moved to a house in Branksome, and we used to have a hotel in Bournemouth, okay, the Winter Gardens Hotel, Tregonwell Road. Apart from me, do you know what all these buildings have in common? Guess? They've all been flattened, okay? They've been completely demolished. I drive past one old address and there's some glass and steel monstrosity on it right now. I go past another, the hotel, it's still rubble. It's been like that for 5 years. It breaks my heart, to be honest. It feels like somebody's trying to airbrush me out of history. But I wouldn't describe myself as devastated, and I haven't spent 4 months mourning and fasting. So come on, Nehemiah, why are you so upset? And the answer is because God has linked his promises at this time in history to Jerusalem. Nehemiah says, verse 9, it is the city where God has chosen for his name to dwell. It's where his people live. It's where one day God's king, his Messiah, will come. And that means as people look at the broken down walls and the burnt out gates, God's name is being dragged through the dirt. You imagine what the passers-by would say. Oh, look, it's Jerusalem. Bit of a mess, isn't it? Yeah, I know. Their God can't be much of a God, can he? Can't even keep the walls up. Shameful. These are more than broken down walls. Do you see? They're casting into question God's faithfulness to his promises. And I think we all feel like that, don't we? We look around at the church in Britain and we think, Lord, where are you? It's about your name and reputation. What's going on? Or we see Christians being persecuted around the world and we think, oh, Lord, why? Or perhaps you look at the things in your life or in the lives of others that you care about that don't make sense and you wonder whether God really loves you at all. Where is he? When you feel like that, I suggest that we should follow Nehemiah's example and turn that grief and questioning to him. Don't suppress your feelings. For 4 months, Nehemiah pours out his messy, snotty, confused feelings to God. Don't suppress. Don't kind of go, oh, I can't hear it. Face up to it. See, God is still looking for men and women like Nehemiah today. People who refuse to grow accustomed to the failure and disgrace of the church in this nation. And throughout these verses, he invites us to get down in the dust with Nehemiah, to weep for our churches, for the churches in this town and nation, and to pray for the honor and glory of God's name. Wonder whether you will do that. God's servant cares. Do you care? Well, if you do care, then secondly, you'll pray. God's servant prays. See, after Nehemiah has mourned and grieved and lamented, can you see he turns to prayer? We got it recorded here. In fact, one of the characteristics of Nehemiah throughout this whole book is that he does pray. Sometimes it's great, long, set-piece prayers like we've got here in chapter 1. Other times, next week we'll see this, they're rushed arrow prayers. And sometimes, as we've seen, they're emotional and messy prayers. But he's always praying. And that's one way that God builds his kingdom. As his servants, pray. Used to end prayer meetings like this. Thank you for coming. Your prayers have made a difference. Do you believe that? That your prayers make a difference to God's kingdom? Nehemiah did. Now, why is that? Well, because when we pray, we come to realize our need of God is total and not partial. We don't need God. Look, when we're praying, we're not kind of going, well, look, we've made our decisions. God, can you just turn up and bless them? It's not what we're doing. We need God totally and utterly. We need to surrender everything to him. We need him to come. That's why this month, as Tim was saying, we're going to come together and lay our hearts before him. I really hope you'll join us on that. And if you want to learn how to pray, well, look no further than Nehemiah's prayer in verse 5, because I think it teaches 3 things we need to know. And the first is this: we need to know God. You need to know the God that you're praying to. It's so easy to lose perspective when you're stressed out or facing a crisis. If you take Nehemiah, shortly, he's going to have to approach the most powerful man in the world, the one you remember who considers himself to be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And this is the same king. If you look back into the book of Ezra, which is kind of the prequel to Nehemiah, this is the same king who stopped the walls of Jerusalem being built in the first place. And Nehemiah is going to face him and say, actually, I think you made a bit of a mistake there. I want to go back and build the walls. How do you do that? Well, you first come to someone who's greater and more powerful than the king. Look at verse 5. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keeps his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your prayers open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. See, Nehemiah knows that God is an awful God, right? Awful. And he's also faithful. And what you get if you put those 2 things together, God is both scary and he's dependable. But notice this, he's also approachable. Let your ear be attentive, your eyes open. If you're struggling in prayer, and I guess some of us are this morning, aren't we? Then it might be you've forgotten who God is. Whatever you're facing, he's more powerful. He's more loving. His ear is listening out for your prayers today. Will he hear you? So come to him. Just like Nehemiah. Nehemiah, remember, he approaches King Artaxerxes, just walks into his presence because of who he is. If you're a servant of God, you can walk into God's presence. Know God. Secondly, know your sin. I want to see how he confesses his sin in verse 6, because it's very striking, really. He says this: I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. He knows why they're in a mess, and it's got nothing to do with these walls. It's the fact that the people, over a long period of time, have sinned. They've turned their backs on their awesome and faithful God, and they decided to run their lives their own way. And the result is catastrophic. God's done what he said he would do, having given them chance after chance after chance. But did you notice how he confesses his sins? Really interesting. We, he says, we Israelites, including myself, we've acted wickedly, we've not obeyed. Now, I doubt Nehemiah was even born when the people rebelled against God. He may never have been in Jerusalem. He could easily point the finger when he's praying and go, oh, Lord, forgive them, those miserable people back in Jerusalem. It's all their fault. I think there's a lesson for us here. Over the next, I don't want to be a bit of a Debbie Downer, right? But over the next few months, things may not go quite as we think they should. I'm just warning you, right? Okay. Leaders may not make decisions that we agree with. We may think they're wrong. Somebody in the ministry area where we serve may not do things quite as we would. And at those times, it's really easy to blame the church, right? To talk about their problem, the mistakes of that law. Did you see what Nehemiah does? It's my problem. It's my sin. It's my mistakes, because these are my people. And he's not being disingenuous, confessing sin he didn't commit. He may not have been in Jerusalem. He may not even committed the same things the people did. But he knows the depths of his heart. I wonder whether we do. We're going to confess them to God. Finally, he knows his Bible. Do you see verse 8? Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses. He's approaching this awesome, faithful God. Because he knows his Bible well enough, he reminds God of his promises. You said, Lord, you said that if we return to you, you gather us from the farthest horizon and bring us to you in Jerusalem. Lord, you promised. I wonder if over Christmas and New Year you had the family down and just for a moment you managed to escape to a quiet room. Did you manage to do that? Sit in your comfy chair, enjoy the peace and quiet. Just as you're sitting there, a little figure comes to the door. Grandad, do you remember yesterday how you promised you would take me and my sister to the park? You promised, Grandad. What do you do at that point? Oh, clear off. No, of course you don't. You get up out of your lovely comfy chair, you leave your peaceful room, and you take her and her sister to the park. Why? Because you promised. You gave your word. And that little one has held you to it. Look, if you want to get your prayer life off to a great start in 2024, then get into your Bible, find the promises of God, and pray them back to him. Lord, you promise, as we were singing earlier, that the gates of hell would not prevail against your church. And I'm now holding you to that. Because I know you're faithful. And I know you will keep your promises. Pray it for the Lord's glory. Pray it for his people. Pray it for yourself. Hold him to his word. God's servant cares. God's servant prays. Finally, God's servant acts. I wonder if you've come across this phrase before. Maybe you look at X, formerly known as Twitter, or I don't know, you just browse things online, and people say things like this. Our thoughts and prayers are with you. Thoughts and prayers. A terrible tragedy occurs, maybe a terrorist attack, a natural disaster, and within minutes, thoughts and prayers is trending online as celebrities and politicians rush to show themselves in this caring and empathetic light. And the criticism is they've not always followed through their thoughts and prayers with any tangible or obvious action. And that's led to a huge amount of anger online. As people see this, it's just a way to pretend to care. Just empty platitudes, thoughts and prayers. Is that what Nehemiah's doing? Well, no. Look at verse 11, would you? Lord, he prays, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. Yeah, he's praying, but he's also going to act on what he knows of God's character and his promises. After 4 months of prayer and fasting, he's convinced that God's calling him to be a part of the solution. And like Esther, he sees himself as cupbearer to the king for such a time as this. See, he's not a fatalist. God's might and power propels him into action. And I wonder, can I ask you, what have you been praying about recently? Maybe it's longer than 4 months. I wonder whether God is asking you now to take action and to do something about it. And maybe the reason you haven't done it is because, quite frankly, it's scary. The thought of it makes you anxious. I can't do this. Now, if you feel like that, and we all do from time to time, don't look at Nehemiah. See, as good as Nehemiah is, we need a better and greater Nehemiah. And we have one in Jesus. Jesus is the true servant of God. He's the one whose heart stirs for his people in deep love when he sees them in distress. He's the one whose prayers are perfectly in line with the will of the Father. And he's the one who takes action by stepping down from heaven into our world, bearing our sin, becoming our servant before rising from the dead. See, it is Jesus who's the real King of Kings and Lord of Lords, not little Artaxerxes. And he has a much greater building project than the walls of a city. He is building his kingdom in this town, restoring humanity, making a new city, the people that he loves. And the amazing thing about all of this is he wants to use us. Now, I don't know about you. I'm really excited about this, yeah? And I'm a little bit nervous, right? And that's okay, as long as we turn to our faithful God. So I wonder what he's going to do this year, 2024, with the Vine and Poole Christian Fellowship. I wonder what he will do through you and me. Can we have a chance just to reflect on that? I'm going to ask Tim to come up and help us, the band maybe to come and join us here. We're just going to have a few minutes, the end of our time, before we get that lovely lunch, to reflect. What is God saying to us this morning? Thanks, Tim.